This is Gareth Aden, and I'm here with noted Nashville attorney John Chambers on behalf of the Nashville Bar Association Oral History Project that we do in conjunction with the Tennessee Bar Foundation. John, it's a pleasure to be here, and I wonder if you could begin by giving us your full name and your birth date.
John Leslie Chambers, February 9, 1936.
And where, please, sir, were you born?
Philadelphia.
Could you tell us a little bit about your parents and what they did?
Well, my father was a research biophysicist by trade. Got his PhD in the early 1930s, was at the University of Pennsylvania when I was born. Moved to Frederick, Maryland in a research capacity there. Then we moved to Cincinnati. But he spent his career in biophysics, virology, ultrasonic, and research in the 30s and early 40s. And for the last number of years, one of the early scientists involved in trying to figure out what air pollution was and what to do about it. So both in California and in Texas.
Fascinating. Was he, during his career, was he associated with universities or?
He was associated with universities until 1946, and then with the government in 2 or 3 different capacities until approximately the early 60s, and then with the University of Southern California, and finally with the University of Texas.
Right. Who was your mother, and tell us a little bit about her, please.
Well, my mother was Ione Way Chambers. She came from Illinois. She was one of the very early college math majors of her gender. She went to Texas Christian University, taught math in Pasadena, Texas, which is now just a piece of Houston, in the early 30s. And then she and my father got married, and she became a housewife, did not work thereafter. A precise New Englander by temperament.
Very good. Brothers and sisters, could you tell us who they are and where they have been?
Well, I have 3 sisters and no brothers. I have a sister who's now retired, or her husband is retired, been at Oberlin College, connected with the Conservatory of Music there for their entire careers, and are now retired in Oberlin. I have a younger sister who is a widow who's in Santa Rosa, California, and she's involved with running hearing panels for arbitration disputes for the realty associations in Northern California. And my youngest sister, some 10 years younger than I, works for an investment firm in Houston, Texas.
If you could tell us a little bit about your childhood, that is, where you grew up, and you briefly alluded to it, but what moves were made?
Well, I was born in Philadelphia, the suburbs of Philadelphia. Went to kindergarten, the first 4 years of elementary school at Drexel Hill, to the suburb of Philadelphia. Then we moved to Frederick, Maryland, which is now basically exurbia, Washington, but then was 45 miles out of town, out in the country. A town of about 15,000 folks, and there was a government research facility there. Skipped the 5th grade, went to 6th through 10 at the Frederick's public schools, transferred to from a small rural high school to a large urban high school in Cincinnati, Ohio, for the last 2 years of high school. Graduated in 1953.
And while you were in high school, could you tell us a little bit about what classes you were best in and what interests you had and pursued?
My fondest memory of the first 2 years of high school was that I took Latin because my parents insisted I take a foreign language. and that was the only foreign language given. So my best friend Jack and I attended Latin. And about a week into a Latin class, the teacher asked us to stay and talk to her after class. The upshot of this was that we made a deal. If we would clean her goat barn every 2 weeks, she would give us A's in Latin. And we cleaned her goat barn, and she gave us A's in Latin, and that was a perfect arrangement until we moved. My father decided to move to Cincinnati, at which point I had to transfer, of course, and the intake principal asked me what I would like to take in terms of languages. I assume you'd like to take Latin since you got such good grades, and I said, no, I think I'd like to try something very different. I took German because it wasn't even a Romance language. But my father didn't learn about that until 3 or 4 years later.
What classes did you do best in? It was
actually history, languages were my most difficult. Foreign language was, whether that was because I wasn't interested or had no facility in them, I do not know, but those were generally my poorest. I did have an occasion after I got out of law school to go back and look at, found some old report cards from high school and grades from all through college and graduate school, and discovered my worst grades were always the first class of the day. Made no difference what the subject matter was.
How about sports?
Played football for 4 days in Frederick. The coach there back 50 or 55 years ago thought that freshmen should be the tackling dummies, and there was a All-American senior who went on to the University of Maryland, and I discovered why I was a tackling dummy, and I decided there were better things to do, and so I ran track, but not very well, and when I got to Cincinnati. Curiously enough, this was in the Midwest. Tennis had not yet expanded very deeply into most of the Midwest, so my first summer I lived out there between junior and senior years of high school. The Parks Department gave me 3 weeks of tennis lessons, and then I taught tennis on a cracked concrete court for the balance of the summer. It was one of my early summer jobs. But went to college, I started rowing pretty seriously. So,
is that right? Did you row throughout your undergraduate college career?
Into my senior year, yeah.
That's something that you don't get to do in Middle Tennessee, really.
Not as much, although it's spreading here. I think Tennessee has a crew now, and Vanderbilt has a club crew, I believe.
During the summer times in high school, what did John Chambers do?
Well, when I was young in junior high school, I drove tractors for farmers who were making hay in those days, because one thing a kid could do was drive the tractor if they wasn't big enough to throw the bales of hay.
Boy, that's something that's no longer done.
No. Had some experience selling Venetian blinds at Chilito's department store in Cincinnati. I carried mail. At holidays, the post office would hire extra carriers to take the Christmas cards around people's houses. But a lot of my work later in high school and college was summer construction work and that type of thing. Later in Cincinnati, I spent a couple of summers working as a lab technician, basically running filtration, cleanup systems and so forth and so on for air pollution filters that were sent from all over the United States and were run through some tests at the Public Health Service labs in Cincinnati.
This was something, I guess, that your dad was connected with
Right,
in some way.
Right.
Anything else, John, that I've left out in terms of the high school or junior high years, in terms of interests or extracurricular activities?
Well, I stayed very busy. I found the adjustment from a rural high school to a major high school to be both a little scary, particularly since I was pretty young for my class, and going from a rural high school with maybe 400 or 500 students at the outside, and the academic side pretty small on that, to a school that at that time, including the junior high component, was somewhere in excess of 4,000, was quite an experience. But I was able to take 5 majors through high school, along with a couple of minors. Was allowed to do some rolling cuts because there weren't quite enough hours.
Right.
And I would do anything to avoid study halls. I hated study halls. So, but other than that, I think I had a pretty normal time.
Well, let's come to your senior year, and the questions about college began to come up. Tell us about that.
Of course, college in those days was not quite the overwhelming admissions event that it is now. I applied to and ultimately went to Princeton University. I had connections. My father had gotten his PhD at Princeton, and I just heard about it for a good part of my life, and applied and was lucky enough to get in, which would be very difficult today. But other than that, I applied to several other schools, but frankly, I don't remember what they were any longer.
Any regrets about your decision to go to Princeton?
No, none.
Tell us about what it was like to arrive at Princeton and how you found the school to be.
Well, Princeton did not allow undergraduates until your second half of your senior year to have automobiles, so basically my father drove me across the country from Cincinnati, not across country, but from Cincinnati to Princeton, deposited me there, and shocked me to death when he said he and his mother had decided to give me X dollars, frankly $2,500, with which I was responsible for paying all my tuition, board, room, and otherwise, and talked to him the following September.
Wow.
And for a 17-year-old, that was, I hadn't expected that, but we got through it, and,
That was for tuition?
Oh, that was forever. That was board, room, and tuition. Tuition alone that year, I think, was, well, if I recall, was under $1,000.
How times have changed.
Yes, yes.
Did you find that you got along with the students that were your classmates pretty well? Did that work well?
Yes, it was. They came from all over the country, from all kinds of backgrounds, private school, public school, so forth and so on. So yes, it was all male then. So there was some adjustment. Of course, the high school I'd gone to was a public high school. And some of the prep school graduates were somewhat better prepared on balance, but that difference wound out in a few, by the end of the first year, you couldn't really tell. But it really was a situation of going from a small pond to a big pond. And Princeton football was just coming off being of national caliber, national standard caliber. Dick Kazmaier, whose name you might remember, was 2 or 3 years ahead of me, and they were, in the Ivy League schools in those days, were championship level, national champion. I recall one of my assigned roommates had been captain of his high school football team, and there wasn't any recruiting in those days, particularly, and he went down to join the freshman football team and came back sort of looking ashen that it turns out there were 55 other football captains, high school football captains, that also turned up, and they weren't going to take all of them. It was a classic situation of jumping into a larger pond. I decided I wanted to do something besides labs and classes and the other things you do. So I tried crew, and that's where I became interested in rowing, 150-pound lightweight, so-called lightweight crew. Yeah.
Was this the 4-man crew?
No, it was an 8.
8?
Right.
Okay.
It was lightweight, which meant that there was a weight limit. There were then and still are 2 classes of intercollegiate crew, and weights have come up a little bit, but I did that for 3.5 or 4 years. And
how did you do academically? Did you, for instance, were you beginning to have some idea of what you wanted to do later?
I started out as an intended pre-med, and delved into the sciences and biology pretty significantly, and stuck with that about halfway through my junior year, and I declared a major at the beginning of my junior year. And at that point, I decided I was really more interested in things like history and otherwise, so I switched majors in the middle of my junior year and had to do some catch-up work, and so forth and so on. So my ultimate degree was in history, and today you'd say I had the equivalent of a minor in biochemistry. And graduated in 1957.
At that time, had you decided that you would go on to graduate school, or were you still sort of uncertain about the future?
I had decided I would prefer to go to graduate school as opposed to what the alternative was in those days if you were reasonably healthy, and that was to get drafted. So at that point, I went to graduate school. That had always been my intent. I was still somewhat ambivalent as to whether to medical school or law school. There were no lawyers in my family at all. I had just sort of developed, I think, an interest in law because I had spent a lot of time on early American governmental history and so forth and so on. So I applied. I didn't know which I wanted to do. I took the necessary entrance exams, what was then called the LSATs and whatever the medical equivalent was, took them both and applied to medical schools and law school, and was lucky enough to get admitted to one of each at least. And so I flipped a coin, and that's why I became a lawyer instead of a doctor. I've never regretted that, but
well, unless I'm mistaken, you were admitted to Harvard and went there for law school.
That's correct. That's correct.
John?
And once again, that's not the same as it is today.
Well, I was going to say it's quite impressive to even, I would think, get admitted to law school at Harvard. What size class did they have?
Oh, Harvard was a reasonably large law school even then. I think I had about 350 classmates. We operated in sections of 4 sections, so sometimes you didn't get a real picture of some of the other sections as much. It was rather intense. And then after my first year of law school, I was married, so I lived off campus.
Right.
But it was a pretty large law school, and once again, it was jumping from a medium-sized pond, even out of Princeton, it was jumping from a medium-sized pond into a pretty serious pond. I mean, some very, very bright people there.
Let me ask you about that. What about your Harvard experience in law school stands out the most? I guess the way I would ask this is, how most did it affect or change you?
I think it required some precision, forced you to think precisely, forced you to think logically, forced you to think analytically. The one memory I have is Archibald Cox, who later became part of the Watergate problem or solution. I I had him for collective bargaining, as I recall, and he posited a hypothetical, as they do in law school, and I was unlucky enough to get called on, and it was one of these hypotheticals where, as far as I could tell, you could take either side. So I answered one way, and he proceeded to beat me down for the next 10 minutes, whereupon I changed my mind, and he proceeded to take my side and beat me down again. I learned a lot out of that. And,
What, any other sort of notable figures that you either had classes under or with while you were at Harvard Law School?
Well, there are several that are still on the faculty, or now emeritus, but they're on the faculty that are somewhat well known in bar circles. But I didn't know him, frankly, I didn't know him in law school at all, but Anthony Scalia was a classmate of mine, and I guess Tom Kennedy was too as well. We had, at a far later reunion, we had a informal, quiet poll of those of us attending the reunion 10 or 15 years ago as to the classmate most in need of going back to law school, and Scalia won.
What about
Mike Dukakis was a classmate.
Oh, really?
And
yes. Later became governor of Massachusetts and a candidate for president.
And he did remark at another reunion shortly after he lost that race that if all the people that had come up and told him how sorry they were that he had lost had indeed voted for him, we would be having the reunion at the White House.
John, what about your decision to go to law school rather than medical school? Have you ever
No regrets.
Again?
It was the right decision.
Right. As you began your coursework and got into your coursework at law school, were there certain areas that most interested you?
Yes, any course that involved planning, process. There was a course called the legal process that two or three professors put together that I did well in and liked. Estate planning, planning process I liked. Some business planning or forward-looking courses. The course I disliked the most, I suppose, was commercial law. And one of the reasons was that the Uniform Commercial Code was just then being adopted. It had been adopted in Massachusetts, and parts had been adopted in Pennsylvania, but otherwise had not yet been adopted around the country. The professor I had for that had been the reporter to help draft the UCC, and as far as he was concerned, that was the law. We never learned a thing about the Uniform Sales Act or all the other uniform acts, or much less anything else. I enjoyed civil procedure, although in that regard, since this is a Nashville and Tennessee Bar Foundation chat, the only thing that was ever mentioned about Tennessee was that was back before the federal rules were adopted. So the only comment was, and then we have Tennessee and Mississippi, which still have separate equity and rules, the old rules of equity.
Well, we have changed our pleading.
Yes, indeed.
But we still have our equity. What about your summer times in law school? You know, these days, many students clerk. Right. What types of things did you do?
The first summer, I helped my parents move from Cincinnati to Los Angeles, and got a job for the summer with the administrative office for the Board of Supervisors for the Los Angeles County, basically their budget bureau. And when in a non-budget season, they did research work with regard to processes and, try to figure out all sorts of things. And that particular job, my job was to go locate. They really didn't even know where all the health department clinics were. So my job for 2 months out there was, I was given a county car and a map and the addresses and powers to interview the health department. And I probably learned more about Los Angeles County than most people do in a long time, in about 2 months, because I visited 65 of the health clinics in every part of that city. It was an interesting time.
Next time I'm lost in L.A., I'll call you.
I don't any longer, but it was very interesting. I don't know that the county got anything out of it. I enjoyed it.
I know that at this time, or at this point in your life and career, you were married, and I believe that in 1963 you had a son, Mark. Is that correct?
That's correct. Well, after I got out of law school in 1960, incidentally, you'd asked the question about what else I did. I did get a job as what was then called a law clerk at that time with the county counsel's office in Los Angeles. And the county council basically did about half what the attorney general's office does here, tax cases and so forth, including a lot of petitions for cert to the U.S. Supreme Court because of unitary tax issues out there. And so I went to work for them. They had 42 lawyers at the time, but nobody ever had law clerks. There weren't such things as law clerks. So the first day I did nothing because nobody knew what this person was. That night, apparently several of them went out and had a beer, and they discovered there was this youngster who needed something to do who was free labor. So the next day I had about 40 of them show up, and they had projects. But summer clerking, summer associate, and all that business basically didn't exist in those days, as you probably remember too.
Right. As you got into your third year at Harvard, had you begun to make up your mind what you wanted to do after law school?
It was partly a voluntary discussion and decision, and partly this was in the late 50s and early 60s. And remember that 75% of my classmates at Princeton went into the service.
I was going to say, this was at the beginning of the
all
Vietnam
my classmates, all the male classmates, there were only 5 women in my class at Harvard Law School in those days. All the male classmates either had been or were about to go in the service if they were not 4F or otherwise exempt. Some were exempt for other reasons. So part of my decision was driven by the fact that I had put off my Cincinnati draft board. And remember, in those days, you were assigned to a draft board when you turned 18. If you moved, you were still in that draft board, which meant that as far as they were concerned, if they had a choice between drafting somebody who lived in Cincinnati or didn't live in Cincinnati, guess who went? And I didn't live there any longer. So I decided I would join the Navy. And so I went to OCS and got my commission and spent 3 years on active duty.
You would have graduated in the spring of 63?
Spring of 60.
The spring of 60, I'm sorry.
Yes, sir.
And so you began at that point a 3-year basic commitment to
I
the Navy?
graduated in the spring. Tennessee, by that time I had decided it was Tennessee where I would pass a bar. So law school exams ended late in May in those days. They believed in a school year going for a full school year. And I guess Tennessee didn't think that students from outside of Tennessee should be given too many advantages, so the bar exam was the first weekend in June. I had 3 days to prepare. So I did that, passed the bar, and then I just did some work with a construction company here for a couple of months, and then reported to Newport, Rhode Island, and had basically 6 months of officer candidate school and justice school and some other schools there. And then in early '61. I was a sailor who never saw a ship at sea, but was ordered to Great Lakes, Illinois, and spent 3 years there.
Tell us about that.
Two sides to that. Number one, I've thought about it often since. It's a great way for somebody in their early 20s to get out in the world and see some things, as opposed to what I think is a lot of youngsters of both that are lost or bouncing around with too many opportunities today. I mean, we had 2 or 3 years to see the world where. Second, the duty at Great Lakes was I was a lawyer most of the time. We tried a lot of cases. I had about 100 general court martials and uncounted special court martials, because that was a clearinghouse for anything between the Rockies and the Appalachians. As far as the Navy was concerned, they were all hauled up. Everybody was hauled there. Third, however, the best experience was to be the command duty officer for the base about every 8 days, 24-hour duty for a base of 40 or 50,000 folks. And you were the officer of the day. Now, we were young, and if anything really went wrong, the captain, the admiral, was up the road. But nevertheless, it's amazing what happens with 10 or 15 or 20,000 young sailors or bored sailors or dependents and so forth and so on. And that was, I had the New Year's Eve duty for 3 straight years. That's on a Navy base. That's very interesting. And
at that time, you were an officer?
Yes.
And I didn't realize it until you just sort of described that, but your legal career basically sort of began in a trial aspect.
That plus the fact that there was a superb small law firm in Waukegan, Illinois, which was the county seat of Lake County, the county that's between Cook County, Chicago, and the Wisconsin border. It had about 400,000 people. Great Lakes was in that. There was a gentleman named Gerald Snyder, who was the senior partner of Snyder, Clark, Dalzell, and Holmquist, if I recall. And there were 7 partners and 3 or 4 associates, which was in those days a fairly good-sized firm. But he handled a tremendous load. And the way he did it was that several of us who were full-bore lawyers at the Navy base basically clerked for him at night. So he had, I learned a lot out of that. And it was a very heavily litigation-oriented firm. The one project I remember the best was that we were charged with representing one side or the other, I don't recall any longer which, of a dispute between the 2 factions of the Croatian Orthodox Church. They had a patriarch in Belgrade, I guess at the time, traditional, and apparently during World War II, the patriarch had been sort of subjected to the German control, and so the American church had sort of split off and appointed their own patriarch and went on their way. And they had an argument as to who controlled the property. And I do recall that I was charged by Mr. Snyder, one of his partners, to find a church law governed. Church law was in medieval Croatian. It was necessary to find a translator, qualified translator of medieval Croatian who belonged to neither faction, and that delved into the University of Chicago finally and found somebody. But that I learned something about finding.
Your 2 years of Latin didn't help.
Not a bit, not a bit, no sir.
Any other interesting things that happened either during your active service up until 1963, or I believe you were in the reserves for a number of years?
In those days, you were committed for a total of 10 years. In that kind of program. Essentially 3.5 years, 6 months and 3 years active duty. And then in the reserves after that. So yes, I stayed tied to the reserves. Had in a category that said you were subject to call up during that period of time with the unit to which you were tied, and I was tied to a CB battalion, Reserve CB battalion. But in one of the, as you may recall, during Vietnam, the political decision was made by Johnson and others not to call up entire reserve or guard units, which to this day I think was a serious mistake, because it then turned out to be almost totally draftee war instead of incorporating a lot of things, for a lot of reasons. But as a result, from 63 through 70, when I came off of that category, my unit was not called and up for active duty, for which I'm very glad. I mean, I had no desire to get tied to a CB battalion, which the Marines laugh at and everybody else thinks are crazy. So,
did you have any sort of experience or backlash with the anti-war movement because of your service in the Navy or the reserves?
No, I did not. Frankly, I was off of active duty before. We were beginning to see service jackets of senior petty officers that had single notations in them: detached duty 1 year, Pacific area.
What was your final rank, John, when you
I came off of active duty as a lieutenant. Got promoted to lieutenant commander in 66, I guess, and remained at that point. One of the reasons I did not stay in the reserves is because I was going to have to do something more to get commander and on up. So I decided at some point my schedule had gotten to the point where I couldn't do it all.
So now we come to about, I presume, 1963, and you are coming off of your active duty with the Navy, and as I recall, you said you had already apparently made a decision about Tennessee. Is that
right.
Correct?
Finished the service at the end of 1963 and came here in January 64.
Why Tennessee?
I had married a Tennessee girl, and basically had a choice between Nashville and the other city. Could have been a choice would be Chicago. And
Right.
I just made the decision. I like the size and the opportunities in this town. Chicago even then was huge, and nothing like today. So.
Any regrets?
No. None.
Tell us what you did when you came to Nashville and how sort of your career began.
I came here in January '64 and went with Bailey, Ewing, Dale, and Bailey. It was Ferris Bailey and Andrew Ewing, and Jim Dale Sr. and Clay Bailey. And I learned there a lot of real estate and a lot of estate planning. Mr. Ewing did a lot of that. I worked primarily with Andrew Ewing, and he did a lot of estate planning. And I had estate planning in law school and liked it. And frankly, there weren't too many estate planners in Nashville in those days. And also did a lot of real estate because that firm did. And I learned a great deal about searching titles.
And you probably ran into my old law partner, Harlan Dodson.
I did.
He had done a little bit of both of those.
And in those days, I think my compensation was $400 a month, which was outstanding, and I would get 50% or half of the law firm's half of title premiums. As you recall, in those days, the title premium of the title companies would charge the $100, of which the law firm would get 50, and I would get half of that, which worked out fine in some cases, but the firm took on a contract with the predecessor of MDHA here in town to search the titles for the Dedrick Street reconstruction again many years ago. And in those days, it was a bunch of little storefronts, and I ran into one 18 or 20 foot lot that had not changed hands since the Civil War. And I mean, there were no divorce records, there were no birth records, there were no nothing involving it. It was here and here. And I spent 2 days on that for a $35 premium, of which of course my half was $17.50, and finally had to report that the only way you're going to clear title on that one is for somebody to take it to Chancery Court because it was interesting.
So you practiced there at the Bailey Ewing Dale and Berry firm for about a year?
Year and a half, until
Okay.
July of 65.
Yes.
At which point my then wife and John J. Hooker's wife Tish were childhood friends, and I got a call from John J. one day, and it was for Hooker and Willis, Bill Willis and Henry and John J. and one or two others. And the long and the short of it, he says, "Why don't you come on over here? We're having fun." And so I did, and we did. And they were there. Later, George Sloan joined us. Bill Barr joined us. Al Knight was already there. It was a good group.
What was that like? You know, that's a firm that that ended up with not only some very fine lawyers, but you had John J. Hooker Jr., who was later a gubernatorial candidate.
He ran for governor in 1966, and I recall that the primaries were in August, and the understanding was that he, of course, would be off campaigning, and that his brother would give him some help, as I recall, and otherwise Bill Willis would advise. You know Bill, knew Bill, and he was deeply involved in things. And I recall sometime early in June, I came to the office, which was a wonderful little building on Dedrick Street, on Union Street rather, 214 Dedrick, Union. It used to be the Bank of Tennessee building. It had two columns up the front. It was very nice.
Is it where Regions Bank now is?
It's a parking lot. It's part of the Metro parking business across the street.
Okay,
Yeah.
across the street.
Yeah. And I came in, and there wasn't anybody at the front door. Went up to the next point. John Jay's office was opposite. Went up the next landing. Henry's office was empty. Went on down the hall. Willis's office was empty. There's a note on my campaign needs. Note on my desk. Campaign needs more help. Law firm's yours. Checked down the hall, and George Sloan, who'd I think been practicing all 6 months at that point, was down there, and I think Al was. I'm not sure what Al was doing. He may have been around or maybe doing some other things, but basically speaking, I learned something about the operation of the books of a law firm, and the library of a law firm. And
You got a baptism by fire.
It was fun. It was fun.
Yeah.
But
How did that? I'm trying to remember now. How did that primary come out?
John Jay lost that primary to Buford Ellington. He decided to. His ambition was to be governor and perhaps other things after that. It was clear
Right.
those days. And he also decided he needed to make some money to do that, I think. And he had gotten to know Jack Massey, and he had gotten to know Minnie Pearl, and he put together the idea of putting together a company called Minnie Pearl Chicken, which would be a copy, as he used to put it many, many years ago, the Pepsi-Cola to KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken's Coca-Cola. That was his aspiration. And he went and organized that and went from put that together.
Did you play any part in sort of the beginning of Minnie Pearl Fried
No,
Chicken?
I was at the law firm.
Okay.
Okay, and stayed at the law firm. Several went through, but Bill Willis and John Jay, and as I recall, Henry. Of course, John Jay went to the company full time, and basically did not practice thereafter. Henry back and forth and did a lot of things as he did then and still does, and Bill campaigned a lot, but he was not. The law firm became somewhat different, and we ultimately reorganized and became Willis, Knight, Chambers and Barr sometime about don't hold me to the dates, 67, 68, 69, somewhere through there.
Okay.
I did work for Minnie Pearl Chicken as a lawyer later on, but starting in about 1969, I guess, I was doing work for the company, which was needed some help.
That brings up two questions, John. One is sort of what was your role at the Hooker and Willis firm while all this was going on? Were you in business practice? Were you in litigation? A little bit of both, or?
Gareth, we did a little bit of everything, and everybody did a little bit of everything. People focused on things, but we did tax work, we did we did litigation. I sat as second chair for a period of time when Bill was assigned down in Bedford County, I believe, for a murder trial defending somebody that was, in those days you were appointed defense counsel, and Bill had got appointed to defend first a death case, penalty case, where a state trooper down there had been shot. It was not a popular assignment for several weeks, so I wrote a lot of wills, estate planning work, and organized companies, got involved in construction problems, some corporate finance, whatever came along. Helped Henry with regard to the representation of a group of 60-odd doctors who were the partners at a Parkview hospital, and recall attending a meeting where those doctors in effect were offered to swap their partnership interests in the stock of something called HCA, Hospital Corporation of America. And so I learned there that I worked hard for a month or two assisting in losing a client because I represented the disappearing partnership.
So that was the period of time when Dr. Frist was sort of beginning the HCA
Yes.
Corporation.
Yes, and Dr. Frist was much older than I was even then, but he was very. This is the present Dr. Frist's father, and so he came to the office periodically and was a brilliant man and good man, good doctor as well.
We need to come back to that if we have the time. John, people have always wondered, did Hooker and Willis really have anyone that ran it, or was it sort of,
John J. Henry and Bill Willis ran it as long as they were there, yes, and Bill was kind of the senior partner. I was there until 1971. By this time, the authorities had condemned the building 214 Union Street, and so we moved up to the old National Life building. They built the tower, and for a while the old National Life was still there, and they leased the first floor offices. So you had these huge old offices there, but eventually that got torn down as well. And About that time, I think it was early 1971, it was Willis Night Chambers and Bar, and had been for a little while. I withdrew from the partnership at that point and established my own office. And
What was your plan in doing that, John? Did you have something distinct in mind, or?
well, one, I thought my interests were somewhat differing. We're moving aside just a little bit from the other. Second, a little bit more of a business orientation than perhaps some of the firm. And third, quite frankly, Bill Willis was a great guy. Really liked him, and just decided, and I think he shared the view that we would remain better friends if we were not partners. So,
Right.
So it worked out quite well.
Now, by this time, I believe John Jay Jr. had run again for governor.
He ran for governor against Winfield Dunn and lost again.
Right.
Well, this time he
was
won
in
the primary, and this was in the general election. That's correct.
Right. And how had Minnie Pearl done? Tell us a little bit about that and what part you
Well,
played.
very briefly, there's a long history about that. In fact, there have been books written by others about that whole era,
Right.
as you probably know. But the short version of it is Minnie Pearl had expanded very rapidly, had investors on the West Coast by this time, had run afoul of the Securities and Exchange Commission for reasons that John Jay, and I agreed with John Jay, were as much politically oriented as anything else, and that John Jay was vulnerable to an attack because of some of the Minnie Pearl chicken growing problems. And Senator Gore was a target of the White House, but they couldn't attack Gore. This was a Vietnam effect. You asked earlier whether Vietnam had any effect. Not directly, but yes, that was involved. That huge investigation ended because by that time I was basically talking for the company. The company basically evaporated. I was doing some local legal work. That investigation ended about 2 weeks after John Jay lost.
And when you went into practice basically on your own in about 1971 or 72, right. Did you continue to represent performance systems or many products?
I represented them. By that time, the performance systems was in essentially a wind down situation. Most of the people had left, and the company was very much in a wind down. It was, by that time, had failed as whether or not of its own fault or other faults is immaterial at this point. It was basically had failed as a chicken restaurant company, or roast beef. We had roast beef branches. It had been turned into Mahalia Jackson out of Memphis was involved. Dr. Benjamin Hooks was involved down there. But I, by this time, was involved in winding things down. We had 135 defaulted 20-year land leases around the United States. Had class actions going from stockholders. We had, so I was representing the company in class action, securities class action litigation here, and was traveling an awful lot, meeting landlords and settling cases.
Did you do any trial work during that period, John, or were you primarily sort of the business arm of this representation?
Well, I was doing other things, doing a lot of other practice. So I was in many ways, I guess it was like what is now today called litigation, but very few litigators, in fact, ever go to court. Is that right?
This is true.
So, yes, I was involved in some chancery court and federal court cases here and also on the Pro Hoc Vice basis and a good many other places. But by and large, we settled most of the. I was involved in settlements. I've been involved in a dozen class action defense cases of a variety of kinds for a variety of things. I've never tried one. They've all been settled. And that's what happens in most cases, as you well know. I've only had one jury case in my trial in my life. Judge James Schwigert. Do you remember Judge Schwigert?
Oh, absolutely.
He was on my side, fortunately, because it was an arson case, and I can't remember whether my client, who was accused of having burned down the place or whatever, it was one of those classic, we're not going to pay the premiums and the policy until we've solved whether it was truly an accidental fire. And we tried it to a jury for some reason or another, and the jury came out against me 12-0, and Jim did the 13th man or whatever it is, and reversed it and said new trial. So by that point the vote was 12-1, and so we tried it again. I lost again, 12-1. He did it again. So at that point the vote was 24-1, and I decided I better stay out of the jury world in Tennessee. So,
John, just a couple of other things. During this period, in addition to your work in unwinding the performance systems, what other things were sort of the mainstay of your practice as you were alone, and then later as you went with Judge Wiseman, Tommy Wiseman?
Well, between those two, several months after I became sole practitioner, a young fellow joined me. Unfortunate situation involving his wife's health. He had moved to Georgia in about a year because of a chronic situation she had. And Jim Beckner joined me shortly thereafter, and then in about 1972, as I recall, and in 1974, Judge Tom Wiseman, lost his race for the governorship, and although he had decided to move back to Tullahoma if he lost the election, his children thought otherwise, and so we got together and we practiced law as Chambers and Wiseman until he went on the federal bench.
What was there sort of a division of work at Chambers and Wiseman, or did you
once
do
again,
a
it's
little
a
bit of
small
everything?
firm. We did a little bit of everything. Now, Tom represented the whiskey wholesalers, and he did a fair amount of government relations work, but he tried a lot of cases, and I think he was basically the spark plug of the firm. We also had a good time. We traveled to Florida together 2 or 3 times because he was on a board of Royal Castle Chicken Systems, Royal Castle Systems down there with me, and we had 1 or 2 occasions, and I'm sure the judge will still tell you about, of handstand contests in some of the restaurants down there in Fort Lauderdale. But we did a little bit of everything. By that time, I was getting involved pretty deeply in representing construction companies and some heavy construction. Until 1982, I was still doing tax planning, tax litigation. When I passed ERISA and a couple of other acts, I decided I couldn't keep up any longer and got out of the planning side and then gradually out of the other side of tax work. But increasingly with business practice as well through the 70s. But
John, when did your partner, Judge Tom Wiseman, take the bench in federal court?
as I recall, it was in 1978. As you know, the process takes a while, so the precise time. But I think he went on the bench in late 1978 when he actually left practice and went there.
And tell me what you did and where you went following his taking the federal bench.
Well, as you know, you had to change the name of the firm when somebody goes on the bench. By that time, George Payne was with us at the time. Tim Beckner was still with me. There were 5 or 6 or 8 other lawyers around, part of the group at that point. Ruth Kennard had ended her 6-year term, or 8-year term, whichever it was, as bankruptcy judge, and she had joined us. So that Aaron Wyckoff, several others. So we continued to practice law at that point. And the firm name actually changed several times over the next several years. Chambers and Kennard, Chambers and Beckner, Chambers are Wyckoff and Beckner, several names through that period of time.
In that period, before you joined the Stokes and Bartholomew firm in 1989, tell us a little bit about your practice, where it was headed.
Well, in some ways, Gareth, it was a continuation of the 70s, because I was mixing both business and practice of law to greater or lesser degrees during that period of time. The Minnie Pearl matter had turned into Performance Systems. Performance Systems never did go bankrupt, but as a result of the need of a West Coast investment group to terminate its investment for tax reasons in 1973. The gentleman now deceased and I ended up in stock control of Minnie Pearl. Not the whole company. We had several thousand shareholders, but we finished cleaning up the business during the 70s. The land leases and the litigations and so forth and so on, paid all the banks back their money, and ended up with 5,000 or 6,000 shareholders, a public company, some cash in the bank, superb bank relations, and absolutely no business, just totally out of business.
What an incredible story.
Well, that left the question. So I was introduced by American Financial, which is a company in Cincinnati, to a group of younger fellows out of Seattle, Washington, Portland, Oregon, that had put together businesses as outgrowths of bank back office servicing operations called Computer Output Microfilm, or FISH, or COM as it was better known, which was the cutting edge way to distribute data in banks or manufacturing enterprises. And they had a series of I think it was 19 offices in the United States that performed these services for banks and manufacturing concerns off of mainframe computers. And the banking authorities, federal banking authorities, told the banks they had to divest themselves of the 50% interest that they had in these ventures because they were no longer really banking related. And so they were looking for money and a vehicle, and I was looking for a business. And people in Cincinnati knew both of us, and so they introduced us. And it took us about 19 days to decide that was a pretty good deal. So at that point, we acquired that company. Those companies, which were actually 6 or 7 joint ventures, we divested their European operation and proceeded from there and changed the name to DSI Corporation. Later on a roadshow for a securities offering, I was asked by some very insistent young analysts, what does DSI stand for? And I said, nothing, just initials. And he said, it's got to stand for something. And I was tired, and I said, well, I guess it stands for Damn Smart Investment, which caused the lawyers traveling with us to have a cow. But so I was doing that. I was involved by that time very deeply in representing a major construction company here. Was involved in by this time, by the 1980s, I was getting involved in class action defense on some environmental matters down in Waynesboro in particular, and some other types of stuff in conjunction with King and Spalding. And so I was bouncing all over and traveling incessantly. I spent from 1977 through 83 or 4, I was in Portland, Oregon, 3 days every 3 weeks. And I was in Los Angeles because we got involved in a video operation in Los Angeles. I was there. And then by this time we were up to 43 cities around the country, and so I was bouncing into those. And I was also practicing law, a lot of it out of town. Okay.
This is the part of your career that I think a lot of Nashville lawyers really don't know about.
Well, one of the prices of that was, I started out doing a fair amount with the National Bar Association. One of the prices was I couldn't do much of that. There's
Right.
a long gap in my service to the bar. In the 70s, I had never had any relations, never met the man, Ray Blanton. I got a call one day saying, Mr. Chambers, would you be the public representative on a commission that the legislature has established to make recommendations concerning the state corporate excise and franchise tax. So I spent 6 or 8 months in 76 or 77, once a week, one afternoon a week, once we would get together, the 4 constitutional officers, 3 senators, 3 representatives, and the member of the public. To this day, I have no idea why I got that telephone call. I never met him before, never met him after that.
But I bet it was a fascinating period.
It was. I learned an awful lot about Tennessee revenue structures, much of which is still true. Met some fine gentlemen, Representative Bragg, John Bragg, some others that were very, we came up with some recommendations, and the 6 of them became the sponsors of legislation, and it passed. And that, in fact, that effort was the Tennessee corporate and excise tax structure until a few years ago, when there were some major modifications made again.
That's fascinating. Now, during this same period in the mid-'70s for about 5 years, am I correct that you were actually the chairman of DSI?
I was chairman, chief executive officer of DSI, and we had a data core operation out of Portland, Oregon, which had its own operating group, and that's why I was out there quite a bit. I tried to get them to move east as the focus of the company followed computers. There were more population and more computers in the eastern part of the country. Tried to get my office to change, and I had some very bright people out there in Beaverton, Oregon, who, when I made the suggestion that we were going to move the headquarters to Nashville, the next time out there they said they had done their homework and they were not moving. And I will tell you there was a reason, which I remembered ever since. I think we had 34 of the 35 said they would not move, which in the nature of that company was just ended it. But that the reason was that in those days, Oregon and Portland and Beaverton schools were superb. They had done their homework and determined that they would have to be putting their kids into private schools to have the equivalents.
And that was the end of that.
And they had done the arithmetic, and although they said that our property taxes on median are $800 higher than your property taxes, by the time we add, all of them had 2 or 3 or 4 kids, by the time we add private education to it, it makes no sense. And they said no.
There's another job that I think you had during the mid-'70s for about 6 years, and that had to do with a Royal Castle Systems.
Royal Castle was 2/3 owned by Performance Systems, by DSI, and that was a Florida fast food chain itself. The other third was public. It was an old line hamburger fast food chain down there. It owned its locations, and unfortunately the demographics of Florida were changing very, very rapidly. and inflation and interest rates were very high in the 1970s and so forth. And we discovered that, I remember sometime in the 70s, the incremental increase in the utility bills for the company in one year exceeded the net profit the preceding year. And when we tried to increase prices, the number of customers remained the same, but the ticket, what they ordered, went, you know. Many of the locations were old locations in older demographics, fixed income, pensions, and they didn't have any more money to spend. So about that same time, it's hard to imagine today, when we have, 7 banks in the United States for all intents and purposes, that Florida passed and permitted for the first time branch banks and branch S&Ls. And it turned out many of those locations were superb branch locations. So we liquidated the company and just, treated everybody right, and actually the stock price, I think, we distributed 10 times what the stock price was before we decided the long process of liquidation. But
so that is really 2 companies that operated on a very wide scale that you helped successfully sort of unwind.
Unwind, although the DSI Corporation, we unwound it down, but we wound it back up again.
Well, that's one that you actually continued to operate.
We were the fastest growing. We were, for 2 or 3 years, Inc. magazine, for whatever it's worth, said we were the fastest growing small company. We started out with 19 offices in 1977, and by 82 or 3 we had 44, 45 offices, plus a video operation, since we had decided to that some sort of video technology would be the next data storage mechanism. Electronic storage didn't come to pass until 4 or 5 years ago, quite frankly.
Did it ever scare you as a lawyer who really didn't graduate from school with the idea of running national corporations? Did it ever scare you to be chairman of these organizations?
It would have scared me to be president and chief operating officer, but not chairman. Big difference. For a second, once again, there are a lot of changes. Business schools were quite small in those days. There were a few: Dartmouth, Harvard, Yale, Chicago. Vanderbilt had a business school. I'm not sure when the Ewing School actually started. There weren't nearly as many business schools. Yeah. The term entrepreneur, this is one of my favorite thoughts. The term entrepreneur wasn't even in the dictionary when I was in college. Now we have vast schools of entrepreneurship. So instead of trying to build enterprises for value, you're now trying to build them to sell. Now, there's a whale of a difference in my view.
Well, that's just fascinating to me. And I'm going to give you another company name, U.S. Data Corp.
U.S. Data Corp was the operating entity for the microfiche operations out of Portland, Oregon. It was really the operating company. We had U.S. Video, which was the video operation in Los Angeles. It had its own management. I was chairman of the holding company, and I was out there with some frequency, and basically learned 2 things have stuck with me with regard to that experience. 3. One, my president of Oregon and I decided that we needed to learn something more about video, because our view was that was going to be the replacement for microfiche as far as the distribution mechanism was concerned. And, well, if you want to know something about video, you needed to go to Los Angeles. That was fine. And then, okay, so let's go find ourselves somebody. And we then made one of the numerous mistakes we probably made, was that we're going to talk to somebody down here to acquire them or joint venture with them or whatever makes sense to both of us. We want to talk to somebody who does not have his shirt unbuttoned to the waist. That was a mistake. All the good ones, in fact, had their shirts unbuttoned to the waist, but we didn't know that at the time. And so we acquired a company, and it worked for what we wanted, but we had an operating section that duplicated video cassettes, VHS, do you remember that?
Yes.
And Beta. You remember Beta?
Yes, I do.
We created those things, and we had contracts with Paramount and some others to chunk these things out by the thousands. And I didn't know much about that. It was not a good business, it turned out, because we didn't create the creative product, nor did we sell it. We were just in between, so there's no margin. It's terrible. And so I learned then by looking at some early computer figures, which I didn't know anything about how to analyze them. And it did dawn on me finally that we were getting better production on Saturdays and Sundays than we were during the week. Worked during 7 days a week operation. Why? Well, it finally dawned on me. We had fewer supervisors on Saturdays and Sundays. If we just tell people what to do and leave them alone, they got it done far faster. And the second thing was I learned what a chairman really does. That this is a true story, that we were supposed to, for Disney required only brand new so-called virgin videotape. Our operator here probably knows what I'm talking about. And we had some people that had come out of the old operation who perhaps shaved it a little bit. You could degauze used videotape, and basically for 1 or 2 trips it worked just fine, as long as it was completely degauzed. Sometimes you could make mistakes. So I recall sitting in my office here in Nashville one day, and I got a call from, I think it was my fellow named Hancock, who ran the operation out there. I said, John, can you be out here tonight? How about tomorrow morning? Why? We got to go meet with Disney. Why? Well, we have a contract with Disney that we would use only virgin tape, and we produced 10,000 copies of, I think it was Snow White, literally. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and they've gotten some complaints that perhaps there was a different ending.
Golly.
That's a true story. And so I went out there, and what my job was is to bow, scrape, and be apologetic for next to forever. But DSI was itself, I was traveling Easter weekend in 82 or 83, I can't recall exactly which. I was visiting my son over at Duke at the time, and went on up to New York and was waiting, read the morning Wall Street Journal out at the airport. As you well know, Gareth, in New York, at least in those days, and probably still true, there's no reason whatsoever to get to a New York lawyer's office before 9:30 in the morning. So I just waited out at the airport with the traffic clear, read the paper, and discovered my company was the subject of an unfriendly tender offer. Okay, and so,
Good morning.
Good morning, yeah. And so we went through that battle for a couple of 3 months. Forced some changes in the nature of the offer. Had an antitrust claim brought by the Justice Department because of some their business and our business overlapped in certain cities. We finally came to a deal where all of my shareholders got something. We were forced to spin off a small operation to keep to satisfy the antitrust requirements in 8 or 9 cities. Which meant you were creating a small companies. So fortunately, I was able to get to a situation where everybody that worked for DSI or DataCorp had the opportunity to keep going. Nobody gets laid off. Because they could either go with the new company or the other company, except, of course, for the chairman. And there's nothing more superfluous than the chairman of an acquired company. So when all that got done, I gave him my resignation and came back to Nashville and kept right on practicing law.
That's wonderful. And as I recall, when you and I sort of chatted a few weeks ago, you said that your lawyer actually asked you to come back to his law firm and have a tutorial about what you'd been through in the acquisition.
Yes, Gareth, about a year or 2 years after that was all done, this would be in the mid-'80s, I suppose. It was the old Donovan Leisure law firm in New York, and they had a lot of folks involved. We, as I say, we had securities litigation going, we had unfriendly tender battles going on, we had proxy fights going on, and so forth and so on. And 2 or 3 years later, they called and asked, they said they had kept all the transcripts, and they had a training session. They had 35 summer associates and some first-year associates and that type of thing, and they put on a 2 or 3 day seminar every year. And they wanted permission to use those records as the basis for this is a project that had a 2 or 3 month discrete period of time. And would I come up and join them to give the viewpoint of the client with some legal background, okay? And then the fellow who was our investment banker from, I guess it was UBS at the time, he very, very bright fellow, and I think also had a legal background. And so we came, it was a 3 day gathering, started at the beginning of the matter. We went through it step by step as to what my reactions were, what my views were as the client with some legal background, what the law firm was doing, what the investment banker was doing, and why. Almost hour by hour, and it was literally hour by hour. It was, those kind of deals are 20-hour days.
You realize, John, that very few people get to go through some of the things that you have experienced.
I've had a very lucky career.
That's it. Well, I have one other thing I wanted to ask you about before we leave business, because this also impressed me. Outdoor Resorts of America. You apparently were very key and instrumental.
Well, I don't know how key and instrumental. That was a company put together many, many years ago by a fellow my age here in town that I met when I was in college. And he put the company together, and the Outdoor Resorts of America was a company that developed recreational vehicle destination resorts on a very high-end basis. He started out in Gatlinburg, but by the 90s he had developed these facilities in Nettles Island, Florida, Melbourne, Florida, River Ranch, which was a huge facility in Central Florida, and Indio, California, and Palm Springs, around the country, destination places. And the idea was that these had golf courses, tennis courts, swimming pools, and people would buy their lots. It was a sort of a condominium idea. And but if you weren't using your RV lot, you could, but we're not required to, just turn them over for rental programs run by Outdoor Resorts of America. There was it's sort of a feast or famine business, depending an awful lot on business cycles, because it's very dependent on discretionary
spending
money, and at least until the last couple of years. But there was a dispute between shareholders, if you will, that developed, and I got asked by both factions to take over as the non-executive chairman, just to be the chairman of the board and so forth and so on. It's the only time I've ever thought about the advantage of court reporters, where we take a deposition and basically you instruct the witnesses and so forth, don't talk over the lawyer, because the court reporter can only do one. We had a shareholders meeting that was going to be very unpleasant and very raucous, and I got a court reporter and sat the court reporter down at the shareholders meeting and just use that court reporter. Not, you've got to quit talking over each other.
Good thinking.
It worked out very, very well. But I didn't really run that company. I became involved in some major reorganization efforts in Tampa, Florida, where I was already doing a lot of work for, River Ranch was about 1,500 acres. I had another client that was putting together about 6,000 acre development north of Tampa.
Well, I still think, John, it's incredible that you have managed to have these business experiences at the same time you've been an active attorney. And I want to use that to sort of go back now, and if you will, let you sort of finish off telling about your career once your law firm, I think you joined in about 1989, Stokes and Bartholomew. Is that correct?
Merged my firm, or at least Ruth
Okay.
Kennard and myself and one other, as I recall, joined Sam in Ogden in that firm in 1989. For a variety of reasons, I best summed up by the fact that I guess it took me about 10 minutes to get over my regret at no longer dealing with book salesmen and hiring secretaries and so forth and so on. And so I've been associated with what was then Stokes and Bartholomew and became Stokes, Bartholomew, Evans and Petrie during a period of about 5 years when the firm connected with Evans and Petrie out of Memphis. 2005, that arrangement split, and Stokes and Bartholomew became part of Adams and Reese, which is a regional firm with a number of offices throughout the Southeast and now Florida.
Right. Right.
And I've been of counsel, special counsel of counsel, throughout that, what is it now, 21 years.
And over the last few years, could you just give us a flavor of what your practice is like and what you're still active in?
I suppose, well, things are much more organized now than they used to be, as you well know, and I think I'm assigned to the transactions practice group, although I thought about that, and I'm spending at least 2/3 of my time back in litigation of all kinds. Frankly, I spent some time on just talking to younger lawyers about what you might call mentoring and so forth and so on. Some business work, still work full time, but not the same intensity that I used to.
Right.
But otherwise, yeah, getting full time. So once again, I have difficulty pigeonholing me into the modern day firm. I've done some work. I spent several months, or actually almost a year, in and out with the while the state legislature was going through its what do they call it, Tennessee Gate or whatever it was, a couple, 3-4 years ago. The Metropolitan Council was going through its disclosure thing, and I ended up chairman of, in large part due to my renewed activities with the Bar Association, ended up chairman of a commission that suggested a new code of conduct for the Metropolitan Council. It took us a while because I just decided it would have no chance unless it was unanimous, and that was a citizens group, and it took a while to get to that point. Great group of people from all over, and but we presented something, they've adopted it, and it apparently has worked, or it didn't work. Either way, I've never heard about it since.
I think it probably worked.
So,
And that was in, I think that was in about 2004 and 2005. You served on that group that recommended the code of conduct.
That's
basically correct. For Metro employees and officers.
oh, metropolitan government.
Right.
The employees already had their own code.
John, in addition to the work for the state in the excise tax and that work for your city, you have also been active in the Nashville bar.
When I slowed down from the business side, I was able to get back into the bar work. I did a little bit, as you probably know, in the late 60s. Back in the days when the Secretary Treasurer kept a notebook and a checkbook, and the question is whether it was $10 more or less at the end of the year.
It was a simpler time.
A much simpler time, yes, indeed. And then during your period of presidency, I think I did a little, but ultimately, I came back involved and got involved with the Fee Disputes Committee, and ended up as chair of that for a period of time. And meanwhile, my now partner, then not partner, and the Tennessee Bar Association got involved in a study group to rewrite the professional rules of conduct for lawyers. And once again, a really great group of folks, which I was not a member of the TBA, Ethics and Professionalism Committee. But when they put out their report in, 95, 96 or something like that for preliminary comment, I was chairman of the NBA thing, and we got together and we wrote a critique that basically they decided to go back to the drawing board, and they decided to co-opt me. So I've been on the TBA Ethics and Professionalism Committee now since the mid-90s.
Yep.
Until now. I went on the board of the Bar Association, Nashville Bar in 90.
No, I think you went in about 2000 to 2003.
That's right.
That's right. And one of my most pleasant periods with the bar has been working with you and Lucian Pera during that period when we were working on the
Yes.
Code of Conduct
Yes, sir.
for attorneys. And,
which, as you know, Tennessee had not adopted the ABA rules of conduct until 2002, even though the Tennessee Bar examination for incoming students was based on the ABA rules and not the Tennessee rules for a number of years. I guess you knew that. And I've practiced, I've been practicing law steadily on a lot of things, but a lot of it is now was transactions. Quite bluntly, there aren't too many transactions going on any longer, and so I do a fair amount of litigation, a fair amount of advising, and that type of thing.
I did not cover this entirely, but I know that you have two children now. Your son, I believe, is he living in Tennessee?
No, he lives in Cary, Raleigh, North Carolina. He's an architect in Raleigh. He's got married with two children. One of whom is leaving for college here in about a month, and I have a daughter living here in Nashville, and she has three children, a stepson and two children. The youngest one is my only grandchild, now age 6.5, and she is a pistol.
And as I recall, you remarried during the 1980s, and your wife is currently working with the Nashville Library?
She basically is she's the operating officer for the Friends of the Public Library. She runs the book sales for them. She is the longest working non-paid person in town, I think, because it's essentially a full-time job with no compensation, but she thoroughly enjoys it and has dragged me out a few times. I think I spent Saturday before last sorting out used books in the basement of the Donaldson Public Library in preparation for the monthly book sales. It's great fun, and I enjoyed it. I really did. But yes, you're right. I've been married twice, basically, as I told you over the telephone. I have celebrated 2 silver wedding anniversaries now. So.
Well, congratulations, and I know you're enjoying the grandchildren, and probably before long, great-grandchildren. Tell us just a moment before we end. You've had such a varied career. Let's start with business. What thoughts do you have about the business world, or words of wisdom in regard to?
No words of wisdom, and most of my business experience has been more recently as a lawyer as opposed to others. I've been on a couple of private boards and construction boards and that sort of thing. But I think it came home to me best a year or so ago when I was asked the last minute to fill in for somebody who was injured and could not cover a course at the graduate school, at school, and so I covered that course in property law. What I was struck by was that the chasm almost between management and business students and graduates as they view lawyers And lawyers' view of them has grown to serious levels. And I think some of the problems that we have seen with regard to the processing of mortgages and so forth in Florida and elsewhere grows out of that hubris, if you will, of many of our business graduates who think that everything can be formulated, everything can be turned into a formula, and they forget that people are involved, and almost a disdain for the thinking process. We ought to be able to turn this into a formula. And that concerns me, particularly in conjunction with the fact that, I've read someplace that of our gross domestic product about 1980, about 4% was, quote, financially related. And by 2007, as I remember, the same figures were reporting that financial activity was up to about 23% of the gross domestic product. Much of that, in my view, has nothing to do with real life. It is the creation of a piece of paper on top of a piece of paper that doesn't reflect much.
That's worthy of reflection. Let's kind of turn to your legal career. What have you noticed in the way of change that you think might be important from your perspective?
Well, one of the changes has to do with what I guess is one of your old partners, Thomas Wadlow Steele, a long, great man, as you well know, and he was representing one of the big 8 accounting companies in the securities litigation of the early 70s. They had done the audits of Minnie Pearl Chicken, and I was representing the company, and we went up and down and all around on that litigation. Finally, both his client and we settled those consolidated cases, and 7 months later he called me and Al Knight, several others that have been representing individual directors, okay, and said, I want you fellas to come on over here and help me out. Price Waterhouse wants me to submit an itemized bill with my hours. I don't keep hours. So we went over and spent the afternoon helping him reconstruct 19 months worth of time. My point is that there's a huge difference in the sense of what has shifted from other billing systems to bill what was right, to an hourly system, to what at some firms, not mine and not yours, I don't suppose, but almost the tyranny of the computer. Once the hour is in there, it's almost impossible to do anything about it. Second, of course, is the growth of law firms to great size. When I came here, I think Bass Berry was the biggest firm in town, and I suspect they had, 13 lawyers at the time, if I recall.
Wow.
And another one of my classmates, long since retired, went with King and Spalding in Atlanta, and Hugh told me a number of times that he was the 17th lawyer at King and Spalding. They're now reporting over 800, not counting contract lawyers. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know. I think to a certain degree, we have priced ourselves out of the market. And if your next question is where do I think we're going, or where do I encourage my kids or grandkids to go in the law? I think, Gareth, you and I both were lucky enough to come up at a time when everything looked rosy as far out as we could see concerning the legal profession and our part in it. Now I'm not so rosy. I think that we have the profession has got a lengthy period of deflating for all sorts of reasons. The number of trials is vastly down from what it was. 366 jury trials in Tennessee last year?
Precisely.
That's down.
It's very low.
There are a lot of things that are just down and not being done so much. to say nothing of computers and all that sort of thing. So I think I'm not so sanguine about this being a temporary downturn in the legal profession, and I'm not so sure, both on the terms of income, terms of getting jobs, or frankly, the satisfactions of the profession that you and I have known. I don't get the sense they're the same any longer. It's become too much grinded out, at least at the bigger firm levels, and you're also part of a bigger firm, not a big firm, but
Yes.
and
I know what you're saying.
yeah, and I think we have a way to go. Sorry to say that, but that's.
Well, it has been a great pleasure for me, John, to talk with you about a notable history and practice that you've had, and I hope you'll have many years in the future. Is there anything that you would like to add?
No, I'm just curious where the gold watch is.
It will be coming, I'm sure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.